Okay, listeners, get ready because we're about to take a deep dive, and this one's a doozy.
Sounds exciting. What are we
Well,
diving into?
you know that visual map of science by Guy Lakeman that someone sent in?
I heard of it. It's supposed to be pretty intense.
Well, it lives up to the hype, let me tell you. It's like he took every scientific discovery in history and wove them together into this massive, interconnected web.
And we're trying to untangle it all.
Hmm.
Ambitious. What's the main takeaway?
Well, Lakeman keeps repeating this phrase. Grasping science fully requires a brain the size of a planet. What do you make of that?
It's certainly a thought-provoking statement, isn't it? I mean, on the one hand, it highlights the sheer vastness of scientific knowledge.
It's overwhelming. Every answer seems to lead to 1,000 new questions.
Exactly. But I think Lakeman is also hinting at something deeper. It's not just about the quantity of information. It's about the connections between different fields, the way one discovery builds upon another in surprising and unexpected ways.
So it's less about memorizing facts and more about understanding the underlying patterns, the relationships that tie everything together.
Precisely. It's about becoming a skilled navigator of knowledge, not just a collector of it.
I like that, a navigator of knowledge. So where do we even begin this journey? Lakeman seems to suggest that math is the key, the foundational language that underpins everything else.
Absolutely. And his map actually starts with the history of mathematical thought, going all the way back to ancient counting systems.
Those early attempts to impose order on the world, to make sense of quantities and patterns.
Exactly. And those early tools, as rudimentary as they might seem to us now, laid the groundwork for some truly incredible breakthroughs. Think about Pythagoras and his famous theorem, all is number.
Right. It's not just about triangles. It's a powerful statement about the underlying nature of reality, the belief that math holds the key to unlocking the secrets of the universe.
Precisely. And that belief fueled centuries of discovery. We see it in the development of algebra, a powerful new language for describing relationships and solving unknowns, and then boom, calculus bursts onto the scene, courtesy of Newton and Leibniz.
And suddenly we have the tools to understand and predict movement, change, the very flow of time. It's like math went from describing static objects to capturing the dynamism of the universe.
And it's important to remember that these weren't just abstract mathematical exercises. They had a profound impact on other fields.
Right. Calculus became the cornerstone of physics, engineering, even economics. It gave us the power to build bridges, design machines, model complex systems. It's hard to overstate its significance.
Absolutely. But
Ah.
then, just when we thought we were starting to get a handle on things, Lakeman throws us a curveball. He introduces mathematicians like Cantor and Gödel, who seem to turn the world of mathematics upside down.
These are the guys who started exploring things like infinity and the limits of logic, right? Mind-bending stuff.
Exactly. And they challenged some of the most fundamental assumptions about mathematics, pushing the boundaries of what we thought was knowable.
So, are you saying they broke math?
Not at all. They just
Right.
made it infinitely more interesting. They showed us that even in the most rigorous, seemingly airtight fields of knowledge, there's always more to discover, more to question. It's actually quite exciting.
So we've journeyed from ancient counting bones to the mind-bending world of infinite sets and the limits of logic, and we haven't even left the realm of mathematics. That's just one thread in Lakeman's vast web.
And here's where things get even more interesting. Because Lakeman doesn't stop at traditional disciplines. He branches out into physics, chemistry, biology, even touching upon fields like philosophy, economics, and sociology. It's all connected.
And that's where things could get really interesting for our listeners. We've seen how math underpins so much of science, but how does this web connect to the messy, real-world problems we face every day? That's what I'm curious about.
And that curiosity is exactly what Lakeman wants to ignite. Because in a world facing complex challenges like climate change or developing new technologies, it's no longer enough to be a specialist in a single field.
Right, we can't afford to stay in our own lanes anymore.
Exactly. We need to be able to see the connections, the overlaps, the ways in which seemingly disparate areas of knowledge can inform and enrich one another.
So we need to become what Lakeman calls polymaths, right? Comfortable jumping between different fields.
Yeah, exactly. He argues that the most groundbreaking discoveries often happen at these intersections where you get these collisions of different ways of thinking. It's like sparks fly and boom, new insights.
And Lakeman actually uses this term graph theory. to describe his approach to mapping science. Is that like what it sounds like? Because honestly, it sounds kind of intimidating. Haha.
I know, right? It sounds way more complex than it really is. Basically, imagine you're drawing a bunch of dots to represent different scientific concepts.
Gotcha. Dots for ideas.
Right. And then you connect those dots with lines to show how they relate to each other. That's basically what graph theory is, a way of visualizing relationships.
Okay, so Lakeman's map is basically one giant, super complex graph showing how all these different pieces of scientific knowledge are connected.
You got it. And what's really cool is that this approach, this whole idea of visualizing relationships, it's not just some abstract theory. It actually has tons of practical applications.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, for one, it's used all the time in computer science. Like, think about how algorithms work, sorting through massive amounts of data.
Okay, I can kind of see that.
But it goes even further. Think about logistics, like figuring out the most efficient way to ship packages around the world.
So you're telling me the same principles they used to map out the connections between, like, quantum physics and evolutionary biology, those are also used to make sure my Amazon order arrives on time.
Exactly. It all comes down to understanding the underlying patterns that govern complex systems. Whether we're talking about the natural world or these human-created networks, it's about seeing the connections, the relationships between things.
And that's where Lakeman's work gets really wild, because then he brings in AI, even going so far as to call it a new species. What?
It's definitely a bold statement. But if you think about it in terms of Lakeman's whole brain the size of a planet thing, it kind of starts to make sense.
Because AI can process information on a scale that our brains can't even comprehend.
Right. Like, imagine giving AI access to this massive map of scientific knowledge. It could potentially see connections and patterns that we, with our limited human perspective, would completely miss.
It's like we've given AI the ultimate power tool, but can it actually handle it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. But for now, let's bring it back down to earth for a second. Lakeman talks about something much more, shall we say, low-tech in his map, the periodic table. Remember that thing from high school chemistry class?
How could I forget? Spent many late nights memorizing those elements.
Me too. And honestly, I never really understood why anyone would bother to organize elements like that in the first place. Seemed kind of random to my teenage brain.
It's funny how something that seems so basic, even boring, can actually be a gateway to this whole world of scientific discovery.
Okay, so how does the periodic table, this chart of elements, tie into everything we've been talking about? What's the big deal?
Well, remember how we talked about those early mathematicians, like Pythagoras, who saw the universe in terms of numbers?
Yeah, all is number, that whole thing.
Exactly. They believed that math held the key to unlocking the secrets of nature. Well, that same belief, that same drive to find underlying patterns, it found its way into chemistry as well.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this.
Early chemists, they started noticing these recurring patterns in the way elements behaved. Like, certain elements would react with each other in very similar ways, while others were like total loners.
Okay, makes sense. So they were looking for some system to make sense of it all.
Exactly. And believe it or not, they actually drew inspiration from a pretty surprising source.
Don't tell me philosophy. Ancient Greek poetry.
Close. Music.
Wait, hold up. Music, you're saying the periodic table is like a giant scientific symphony or something?
Not quite a symphony, but there's definitely a sense of harmony, of order embedded within it. Just like musical notes have different frequencies, different properties, elements have their own unique characteristics that influence how they interact with each other.
Whoa. Okay, so the periodic table, this thing I thought was just a random chart of elements, is actually built on centuries of observation, experimentation, and a dash of musical inspiration. My mind is officially blown.
And that's just it. It highlights this recurring theme throughout the history of science. This deep-seated human desire to find order and predictability in the natural world. We see it in Newton's laws of motion, in Darwin's theory of evolution, heck, even in the ongoing search for a unified theory of everything.
So it all comes back to Lakeman's central point, right?
Mm-hmm.
To really understand science, we need to embrace this vast, interconnected web of knowledge. We need to be willing to look for those unexpected connections, those hidden harmonies that reveal the deeper order beneath all the surface complexity. It's about the big picture.
It is.
It's like Lakeman saying, hey, don't just listen to the violins or the trumpets in isolation. Tune your ears to the whole orchestra playing together.
The symphony of knowledge. I love that. And it really highlights why it's so important to understand science this way, especially today.
Right. Because it's not just about, like, satisfying our curiosity about the universe. It's about having the tools to tackle the really big, messy problems.
Exactly. Take climate change, for instance.
Yeah.
We can't treat that as just an environmental issue anymore.
It's all intertwined, right?
Yeah.
Economics, social justice, tech, global politics, you name it.
It's like a tangled up ball of yarn.
Yeah.
You can't just tug at one thread without affecting everything else.
So where does human behavior fit into all of this? I mean, we aren't exactly known for always acting rationally, let alone predictably.
Yeah, and Lakeman definitely acknowledges that. But he's also cautious about trying to apply the scientific method, at least in the strictest sense, to things like, economics or political systems.
Because people don't always behave the way equations predict.
Exactly. We're complicated. And Lakeman even uses the term pseudoscience sometimes to describe attempts to make these fields seem overly precise. Like they have all the answers.
So he's not advocating for blindly following the science as if it's some kind of like dogma or a guaranteed path to the absolute truth.
No way. In fact, he pushes back against this idea that there's just one scientific method that applies to absolutely everything.
Because like we were talking about before, different fields have different approaches.
Exactly. Physicists do their thing, ecologists have their methods, and so on. It's about understanding the tools of each field. But even more importantly, it's about recognizing that science is a process. It's about constant questioning and refining.
Being okay with not having all the answers, being open to new information.
Absolutely. And that takes us right back to Lakeman's main point. Following the science doesn't mean blindly accepting everything with a label science slapped on it.
It's about being a critical thinker, asking the hard questions, evaluating evidence, spotting biases, and getting comfortable with a little bit of uncertainty.
100%. And, that's what I find so refreshing about Lakeman's work. He lays out this incredibly complex, almost overwhelming vision of scientific knowledge, but he doesn't leave us feeling hopeless or insignificant in the face of it all.
Totally. Like, it'd be easy to look at that map and think, well, I'm just one tiny brain. I'll never grasp all of this. But that's not the message at all, is it?
Nope. If anything, it feels more like an invitation, a challenge even. What if that brain the size of a planet Lakeman talks about isn't meant to be taken literally, but as a metaphor for what we can accomplish together?
Through collaboration, shared knowledge, constantly pushing those boundaries, right?
Right.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Guy Lakeman's incredible map of science, I hope you, our listeners, are feeling, I don't know, maybe a little bit mind-blown, but also really inspired.
Inspired to keep asking questions.
Yes, because the more we learn, the more we realize how much there still is to discover.
Yep.
And that's what makes science so endlessly fascinating.
It's a journey without a finish line.
That's a great place to end it. Until next time, keep those questions coming, listeners, and keep exploring those connections.